From a gruesome broken arm to the most unexpected KO ever, these are the 8 craziest comebacks in UFC history. Number 8. The Frank Mir versus Antonio Rodrigo Nogueira rematch. This was one of the most iconic UFC fights ever, but it was over in the blink of an eye. It happened at UFC 140 in December 2011. Big Nog took control of the fight early on, getting in some big punches and eventually dropping Frank. Nogueira started pouring huge shots. Mir looked completely unconscious. Nog went for the guillotine, but this turned out to be a big mistake as Frank quickly rolled and managed a Kimura lock. Not only did Frank win the fight, but he actually broke Nogueira's arm. That has to be the most intense 3 minutes in UFC history and definitely one of the fastest comebacks. And while we're looking at gruesome injuries, number 7, Darren Elkins versus Mirsad Bektic. Darren Elkins is known as Damage, and the man can definitely deal with damage. Darren is known as one of the toughest fighters in UFC history, and for good reason. His fight against Mirsad Bektic is probably the best example. The pair fought at UFC 209 back in 2017. You may not remember Bektic nowadays, but back then, he was expected to be the next big thing in the flyweight division. And despite the fact that Elkins was the veteran fighter, Bektic was the clear betting favorite. Many thought Mirsad would have an easy time against the older man, and for a while it looked like they were correct. In the first round, Bektic secured a takedown from where he landed some nasty elbows. One of these opened a huge gash on Elkins' face. Definitely one of the biggest cuts I've ever seen in the UFC. Somehow, Darren survived the second round as well and made it to the final round. Despite looking like he was coming from a slaughterhouse, however, Elkins was the tougher man, and he was able to force some big mistakes out of Bektic, eventually securing an insanely unlikely TKO victory with some perfect strikes against the fence. Elkins looked like a mess at the end of the fight, but one of the happiest messes I've ever seen. Elkins definitely looked bad with that cut, but he wasn't nearly as rocked as our next fighter. Number 6. The Frankie Edgar versus Gray Maynard rematch. In his first championship bout, Gray Maynard came insanely close to becoming the lightweight champion of the world. He dominated Edgar in the first round, dealing out a ruthless beating, and at some points Frankie looked like he couldn't even stand. Maynard came insanely close to finishing the fight in the first round. But hey, UFC champions are made of something else. Edgar picked up the pace in the second round and turned the fight into an epic battle, possibly the greatest in the history of the lightweight division. In the end, the fight was declared a draw, and somehow, Edgar managed to keep his belt. Maynard had another shot at Frankie a few months later, but that time around, Edgar managed to take him out by TKO. The pair put on an amazing rivalry, but it doesn't have the legendary status of this fight. Number 5. Brock Lesnar versus Shane Carwin. Nothing feels as classic as a Brock Lesnar fight, and this one is definitely up there as one of his most impressive performances. Shane Carwin proved to be a huge test for Lesnar as he dominated round 1 and scored some big punches against the fence. If this fight had happened in 2023 instead of 2010, it probably would have been stopped. But things were wild in those days, so the fight just kept going. At the end of the round, Brock somehow managed to stay on his feet and was ready to declare war. At the start of the second round, Lesnar scored a massive takedown and choked Carwin into a submission. That comeback cemented Lesnar as a legend, but it isn't the greatest comeback choke ever. We still have a couple of those on the way. Number 4. Anderson Silva versus Chael Sonnen. Nowadays, we remember Chael Sonnen as a funny guy who basically pioneered the art of trash talking in MMA. But the truth is, we often forget just how good Sonnen actually was back in the day. Anderson Silva completed a 16-fight winning streak, the longest official winning streak in UFC history. But the first man who ever came close to breaking that streak was Sonnen. Uncle Chael faced Silva for the first time in 2010, and believe it or not, Sonnen was amazing in that fight. His grappling was brilliant, and his striking clearly outmatched Anderson. However, with only 2 minutes to go, Sonnen made a fatal mistake while he was on top. Silva secured a lethal triangle choke and forced Chael to tap. It was a crazy fight, but nowhere near as crazy as this one. Number 3. Cheick Kongo versus Pat Barry. When we think of epic comebacks in the history of the UFC, this is often the first one that comes to mind. It's probably fair to say that both Congo and Barry are best remembered for this moment, which went down in UFC history. The fight got off to a crazy start, with Pat Barry landing a massive right hook on Congo's head. That was enough to send him straight to the ground, where Barry kept hitting Congo hard, but somehow the Frenchman managed to get up. Congo was up for a second before another huge right sent him straight back to the canvas. The crowd couldn't believe Congo was still alive, never mind still in the game. But Congo somehow made it back to his feet yet again and struck Barry twice with 2 perfect shots, more than enough to knock Pat into the following century. That fight became legendary in MMA culture, but when it comes to legendary comebacks, nothing can beat this one. Number 2, the Matt Hughes versus Frank Trigg rematch. This fight brings us back to 2005 and the Wild West days of the UFC. Hughes had recently defeated GSP to become the welterweight champion of the world, and Trigg was coming to get him. The challenger was on to a great start, partly thanks to a massive knee to the crown jewels that the ref somehow didn't see. This nasty blow allowed Trigg to take Hughes down for some good old ground and pound. Things weren't looking good for Hughes, but they got even worse. Trigg got a hold of Hughes's back and secured a rear naked choke. Even though his face was going red, Matt managed to escape and pulled off one of the most daring moves in history. Hughes lifted Trigg and ran across the entire octagon to slam him on his back for one of the greatest takedowns ever. And just a few seconds later, it was Trigg who was tapping to Hughes's choke. It was mind-blowing. Some of the greatest minutes ever in this sport, and of course that leads us to number 1. Number 1. The Leon Edwards versus Kamaru Usman rematch. Some old school fans may not be happy about this one, but this has to be number 1. On this list, we've seen gruesome fights, horrible cuts and injuries, and some heroic performances. However, despite this fight not being as gruesome, it deserves the top spot because of how insanely unexpected it was. I mean, nobody thought Leon could be a match for Usman. They had fought years earlier, and Kamaru comfortably won that fight. During their title fight, Leon had a great first round. But after that, Usman dominated every aspect of the game, and Edwards was hanging on for dear life. Edwards looked beaten, not just physically, but mentally. The crowd, the commentators, and even Leon himself had given up on the fight. Only a miracle could save Edwards. Well, a miracle, or a massive head kick in the last minute of the fight. That kick has to be one of the greatest KOs ever. And it made Edwards the welterweight champion of the world with the greatest comeback ever in UFC history. And that's all for now, fight fans. From a gruesome broken arm to the most unexpected KO ever, these are the 8 craziest comebacks in UFC history.